Hey everyone, picture this. It's November 1863, and you're a Union soldier camped somewhere in Virginia. The autumn air is crisp, your stomach is growling from another meal of hardtack and salt pork, and you're wondering if you'll ever taste your mother's cooking again. Then something extraordinary happens. A proclamation arrives from President Lincoln himself, declaring that every American should set aside the last Thursday of November for Thanksgiving and prayer. But here's the thing, your country is literally tearing itself apart in the bloodiest conflict it has ever seen. Families are divided, brothers are fighting brothers, and the very notion of what America means is being decided on battlefields across the continent. So how do you give thanks when your nation is at war with itself? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and overlooked stories of the Civil War era, the birth of our modern Thanksgiving tradition, forged not in peace and prosperity, but in the crucible of America's greatest crisis. This isn't just a story about turkey and cranberry sauce. It's about how a divided nation found reasons to be grateful in its darkest hour, how a magazine editor's 17-year crusade finally convinced a president, and how soldiers far from home discovered that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply remember what you're fighting for. Before we get started, I want you to do something for me. Think about your last Thanksgiving dinner. The faces around the table, the conversations, maybe even the arguments. Now imagine that half the people you care about are missing, and you don't know if they're alive or dead. That was the reality for millions of Americans in 1863, when Thanksgiving became a national holiday. Yet somehow, they found ways to celebrate. They found reasons to hope. And their story might just change how you think about gratitude itself. So settle in, maybe grab something warm to drink, and let's travel back to a time when giving thanks required more courage than most of us will ever need. Because this story doesn't just belong in history books, it belongs in our hearts, reminding us that even in our most fractured moments, we can still find reasons to come together. The story of Civil War Thanksgiving begins not with Abraham Lincoln, though he gets most of the credit, but with a determined woman named Sarah Josepha Hale. Picture a New England widow in the 1840s, raising 5 children while editing the most influential women's magazine in America. Sarah wasn't just any editor. She was a cultural force, shaping the thoughts and traditions of over 150,000 subscribers across the country through her magazine, Godey's Lady's Book. And she had a mission that would consume 17 years of her life. Sarah grew up in New Hampshire, where Thanksgiving was already a cherished tradition. Every autumn, families would gather for elaborate feasts. Churches would hold special services, and communities would come together to acknowledge their blessings. But here's what frustrated Sarah. This beautiful tradition was mostly confined to New England. The rest of the country celebrated sporadically, if at all. Different states held Thanksgiving on different days, some not at all, and there was no unified national observance. To Sarah, this felt like a missed opportunity of enormous proportions. Starting in 1846, Sarah began what can only be described as one of the most persistent lobbying campaigns in American history. She wrote to President Zachary Taylor, explaining her vision of a national day of Thanksgiving that could unite Americans from Maine to California. When Taylor died in office, she wrote to his successor, Millard Fillmore. When Fillmore left office, she wrote to Franklin Pierce, then to James Buchanan. Each president received passionate, carefully crafted letters explaining why America needed this holiday. Each president politely declined or simply ignored her requests. But Sarah wasn't just writing letters. She was using her magazine as a platform, publishing elaborate Thanksgiving menus, heartwarming stories about family gatherings, and detailed descriptions of the perfect Thanksgiving celebration. She painted pictures of roasted turkeys with savory stuffing, tables groaning under the weight of pumpkin pies and cranberry sauce, and families united in gratitude. Through her magazine, She was essentially creating the template for what American Thanksgiving would become, even before it was officially recognized. Her readers loved it. Subscriptions grew, and families across the country began adopting the New England Thanksgiving traditions that Sarah promoted so enthusiastically. But still, there was no national recognition, no unified date, no presidential proclamation that would make Thanksgiving truly American, rather than merely regional. As the 1850s progressed and tensions over slavery intensified, Sarah's mission took on new urgency. She began to see Thanksgiving not just as a nice family tradition, but as a potential tool for national unity. In her magazine and in her letters to politicians, she argued that a shared national holiday could help bridge the growing divide between North and South. If Americans could come together once a year to acknowledge their common blessings, perhaps they could remember what united them rather than what divided them. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her magazine had subscribers in both northern and southern states, yet the country seemed to be pulling apart at the seams. Her husband had died young, leaving her to support their family through her writing and editing. She understood hardship, she understood loss, and she understood the healing power of tradition and community. These weren't abstract concepts to her. They were personal truths forged in her own experience. By 1860, as Abraham Lincoln was elected president and southern states began talking seriously about secession, Sarah's letters became more urgent. She wrote to Lincoln even before he took office, explaining her vision and pleading with him to consider a national Thanksgiving proclamation. But Lincoln had slightly more pressing matters to deal with. The country was falling apart, and by April 1861, the Civil War had begun. Now, you might think that wartime would be exactly the wrong moment to establish a holiday devoted to gratitude and family gatherings. After all, families were being torn apart, young men were dying in unprecedented numbers, and the very existence of the United States as a unified nation was in question. But Sarah saw it differently. She believed that wartime was exactly when America most needed reasons to come together, most needed reminders of what they were fighting to preserve. The war's early years were catastrophic for both sides. The Battle of Bull Run in 1861 shattered illusions that this would be a quick conflict. The Peninsula Campaign, the Battle of Shiloh, the 7 Days battles, all revealed that this war would be longer, bloodier, and more devastating than anyone had imagined. By 1862, the casualty lists were staggering, and it was clear that every American family would be touched by loss. Yet Sarah persisted. In 1862, she wrote again to Lincoln, this time with even greater passion. The country was bleeding, she acknowledged, but that made gratitude more important, not less. Americans needed to remember what they were grateful for, what they were fighting to protect, what united them as a people. A National Day of Thanksgiving could provide that reminder. Lincoln was facing his own crisis of faith and purpose. The war wasn't going well. Political pressure was mounting from all sides, and he was wrestling with momentous decisions about slavery, military strategy, and the very future of American democracy. He was also dealing with personal tragedy. His beloved son Willie had died in February 1862, plunging both Abraham and Mary Lincoln into deep grief. The president understood loss in ways that few people could comprehend. But something was shifting by 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued in January, fundamentally changing the war's moral character. The Battle of Gettysburg in July had turned the tide militarily, though at enormous cost. The siege of Vicksburg had given the Union control of the Mississippi River. For the first time since the war began, Lincoln had reasons to believe that the Union might actually prevail. It was in this context that Sarah wrote her final letter to Lincoln in September 1863. This time, her words found their mark. She wrote about the increasing interest across the land in holding Thanksgiving on the same day in all states. She spoke of the permanency and unity that a great American festival of Thanksgiving could provide. She appealed to Lincoln's vision of what America could become after the war ended. Lincoln read her letter carefully. He discussed it with his cabinet, particularly with Secretary of State William Seward. They recognized that such a proclamation could serve multiple purposes. It could boost morale in the Union states, provide comfort to families grieving their losses, and offer a vision of eventual national reconciliation. It could also demonstrate that the Union government was still functioning normally, still capable of thinking beyond the immediate crisis of war. On October 3rd, 1863, Lincoln issued the proclamation that would change American culture forever. But the words weren't entirely his own. Secretary of State William Seward actually drafted most of the text, though Lincoln reviewed and approved every word. The proclamation was carefully crafted to acknowledge both the blessings America had received and the terrible cost of the ongoing conflict. The proclamation began by recognizing the year's blessings: fruitful fields, healthful skies, and what Lincoln called bounties that Americans were prone to forget. But it also acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, peace had been preserved with foreign nations, order had been maintained, and laws had been respected everywhere except in the theatre of military conflict. This was a remarkable statement when you think about it. Lincoln was essentially arguing that despite a war that was tearing the country apart, American institutions were still functioning. The government was still operating, foreign relations were stable, and civil society continued in most of the country. It was both an acknowledgement of crisis and an assertion of resilience. But Lincoln didn't stop there. The proclamation also included what might be the most poignant passage in any presidential document of the era. He recommended that Americans offer thanks while also remembering with humble penitence the nation's perverseness and disobedience. He asked his fellow citizens to commend to God's tender care all those who had become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife. And he fervently implored divine intervention to heal the wounds of the nation. This wasn't triumphant rhetoric. This was the language of a leader who understood the terrible cost of the choices his administration had made, who recognized that victory would come with a price that could never fully be calculated. Lincoln was asking Americans to be grateful, while simultaneously acknowledging that they had much to repent for, much to mourn, and much to heal. The response to Lincoln's proclamation varied dramatically across the divided nation. In the Confederate States, the proclamation was largely ignored or actively rejected. Jefferson Davis had already issued his own Thanksgiving proclamations tied to Confederate military victories, and Southern newspapers dismissed Lincoln's proclamation as another example of federal overreach. Many Southerners saw it as an attempt to impose Northern traditions on the entire country, which was exactly the kind of cultural imperialism that had helped drive them to secession in the first place. But in the Union states, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Newspapers praised the proclamation, churches organized special services, and families began planning the kind of elaborate Thanksgiving celebrations that Sarah Hale had been promoting for decades. The timing seemed perfect. Coming just months after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the proclamation felt like a recognition that the war might actually be winnable, that there might actually be something to be thankful for, after all. The first official national Thanksgiving was held on November 26, 1863. Across the Union, families gathered for meals that attempted to approximate normal celebration, despite the absence of so many young men. Churches held services that combined traditional Thanksgiving themes with prayers for soldiers and for national healing. Communities organized collections of food and supplies to send to military units, making the holiday not just about private gratitude, but about public service. The holiday took on a bittersweet quality that would define American Thanksgiving for generations to come. It was about abundance and gratitude, yes, but it was also about absence and loss. Tables had empty chairs, families said prayers for missing loved ones, and the traditional feast was shadowed by awareness of those who would never come home. This mixture of joy and sorrow, of celebration and mourning, became embedded in the American understanding of what Thanksgiving means. For Union soldiers, that first official Thanksgiving was both a gift and a reminder of everything they were fighting to preserve. The reality of soldier life during the Civil War makes the significance of that first Thanksgiving even more profound. Picture this. You're a Union soldier whose daily ration consists of 12 ounces of salt pork, a pound and 6 ounces of hardtack. That's so tough you need to soak it in coffee just to chew it, and maybe some desiccated vegetables that the men sarcastically called desecrated vegetables because they tasted like compressed cardboard. You're living in a tent or a rough wooden barracks, sleeping on the ground, and you haven't had a decent meal in months. Then word comes down that the folks back home are organising something special. Letters start arriving from aid societies, from church groups, from families you've never met, all promising that Thanksgiving Day will be different. They're not just sending prayers and good wishes, they're sending food, real food, turkey and chicken and pies, and all the things that remind you why you left home in the first place. The logistics of feeding hundreds of thousands of soldiers spread across multiple theatres of war were staggering. This wasn't like shipping supplies to a single location. Union forces were scattered from Virginia to Tennessee, from Missouri to Louisiana, in camps and hospitals and aboard naval vessels. Getting fresh food to all these locations before it spoiled required coordination that would challenge modern shipping companies, let alone Civil War-era transportation networks. But somehow, it worked. The Union League Club of New York took the lead, organizing what they called the grandest dinner party in American history. They collected over $250,000 in donations. Not just money, but actual food contributions from every northern state. Families who had never met a soldier personally spent their own money buying turkeys to send to strangers. Restaurants donated entire meals. Bakers worked overtime producing thousands of pies and cakes and loaves of fresh bread. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. Over 370,000 pounds of poultry alone. Thousands of gallons of cranberry sauce. Mountains of potatoes and vegetables. Train cars loaded with pies and cakes and preserves. Ships carrying tons of fresh provisions down the Atlantic coast and up the Mississippi River. It was a massive civilian mobilization focused not on producing weapons or ammunition, but on producing joy. The soldiers' response tells us everything we need to know about what this meant to them. One soldier wrote to the New York Times describing how it felt to realize that people back home were thinking about them, caring about them, making sacrifices for them. Far away from the home and friends we so dearly love, he wrote. Exposed to hardships, danger, and death, it's pleasing to us to know that we are still remembered in the prayers, sympathies, and kindness of the loyal hearts of our noble states. Think about that for a moment. These men were facing death daily, living in conditions that would horrify us today, separated from everything they loved and familiar. And what moved them to tears wasn't just getting better food. It was knowing that they weren't forgotten, that their sacrifice mattered, that people they'd never met cared enough to send them turkey and pie. The actual Thanksgiving celebrations in military camps reveal something beautiful about human resilience. Soldiers who had been sleeping in mud and eating hardtack suddenly found themselves seated at long tables made from wooden planks and sawhorses, sharing meals that reminded them of home. They played games, sang songs, told stories about their families and their plans for after the war. For a few hours, the war felt distant, almost unreal, but these weren't just happy celebrations. Many of the Thanksgiving gatherings included empty places set for soldiers who had died since the previous year. Regiments that had suffered heavy casualties held memorial services alongside their feasts. The holiday became a way of honouring the dead while celebrating the living, of acknowledging loss while affirming hope. The experience was particularly poignant for the African American soldiers who were fighting not just for the Union, but for their own freedom and the freedom of their people. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, made famous in the movie Glory, held their own Thanksgiving celebration in 1863. Private David Demas wrote to his wife about the great time that we had on Thanksgiving. It was the best day that we ever had since I left home. For these men, Thanksgiving carried additional layers of meaning. They were giving thanks for the opportunity to fight for their own liberation, for the chance to prove their courage and patriotism, for the possibility that their children might grow up free. The holiday became intertwined with their hopes for what America could become, not just what it had been. The civilian experience of Thanksgiving during the Civil War was equally complex. Families gathered around tables that felt too big, too empty. They said prayers for sons and husbands and brothers who might be eating military rations hundreds of miles away, assuming they were eating at all. The traditional Thanksgiving menu, promoted so enthusiastically by Sarah Hale's magazine, became both a comfort and a reminder of what was missing. Women played particularly crucial roles in these wartime Thanksgivings. They organized the food drives for soldiers. They held their families together despite absent husbands and sons. And they created celebrations that maintained some sense of normalcy for children who had never known peacetime. In many ways, the Civil War Thanksgiving became a showcase for the strength and resourcefulness of American women. The recipes and menus from 1863 and 1864 reveal how families tried to maintain tradition while adapting to wartime shortages. Sugar was expensive and sometimes unavailable, so cooks substituted honey or molasses. Fresh meat was often requisitioned for the military, so families made do with preserved meats or went without. The elaborate menus published in Godey's Lady's Book represented an ideal that many families couldn't afford. But they did their best with what they had. Churches played central roles in these early Thanksgivings, providing not just spiritual comfort, but practical organization. Ministers preached sermons that tried to balance gratitude with acknowledgement of suffering. Church committees organized food collections for soldiers and for local families in need. The holiday became a community effort, not just a family celebration. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Civil War Thanksgiving was how it created shared experiences across vast distances. A soldier eating turkey in Virginia was participating in the same ritual as his family back in Ohio. The holiday became a way of maintaining connection despite separation, of affirming that they were still part of the same community, the same nation, the same story. The Confederate response to Union Thanksgiving celebrations reveals the deep cultural divisions that the war had created. Jefferson Davis had proclaimed his own days of Thanksgiving, tied to Confederate military victories, but these were explicitly Confederate celebrations, not American ones. When Union families gathered for Thanksgiving in 1863, they were implicitly asserting that there was still such a thing as the United States of America, that the Confederate rebellion had not successfully destroyed the Union. Southern newspapers criticized Lincoln's Thanksgiving proclamation as political manipulation, an attempt to use religious sentiment for partisan purposes. They weren't entirely wrong. The proclamation did serve political functions, boosting morale and reinforcing loyalty to the Union cause. But it was also genuinely religious, genuinely felt, genuinely needed by people who were struggling to find meaning in unprecedented suffering. The timing of that first national Thanksgiving, coming just months after Gettysburg, wasn't coincidental. Lincoln and his advisors understood that the Union needed a psychological victory to match its military ones. The holiday provided that victory, demonstrating that American institutions and traditions could survive even the worst crisis in the nation's history. As 1863 turned into 1864, Thanksgiving began to establish itself as a permanent part of American culture. The second wartime Thanksgiving was even more elaborate than the first, with better organization and broader participation. The Union League Club's massive food drive for soldiers became an annual tradition, and other organizations followed their example. The holiday was evolving in real time, shaped by the specific circumstances of war but also by deeper American values and traditions. It combined religious observance with patriotic celebration, private family gathering with public service, gratitude for blessings received with acknowledgement of prices paid. These tensions and complexities would define American Thanksgiving for generations to come. But the most important thing about Civil War Thanksgiving wasn't the food or the proclamations or even the military celebrations. It was the simple act of Americans choosing to give thanks in the midst of their greatest trial. They could have chosen despair, anger, or resignation. Instead, they chose gratitude. They chose to believe that their suffering had meaning, that their sacrifices would lead to something better, that there were still reasons to hope. This choice wasn't easy or automatic. It required courage, faith, and a kind of stubborn optimism that refused to be defeated by circumstances. The soldiers eating turkey in muddy camps, the families praying around half-empty tables, the women organizing food drives for strangers, all of them were making the same fundamental choice, to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, that their nation was worth preserving, that gratitude was stronger than grief, and that choice had consequences that extended far beyond any single holiday or any single year. By 1864, the pattern was firmly established. Thanksgiving had become not just a day of celebration, but a measuring stick for how America understood itself. The holiday forced people to ask difficult questions. What are we grateful for? What are we fighting to preserve? How do we find meaning in suffering? The second wartime Thanksgiving in 1864 revealed just how deeply the holiday had embedded itself in American consciousness. The war was entering its fourth year, and the initial enthusiasm had long since given way to grim determination. The casualty lists were beyond anything anyone had imagined possible. Families had been decimated. Entire communities had lost their young men. Yet somehow, the commitment to Thanksgiving had only grown stronger. The organizational machinery that had seemed so miraculous in 1863 was now operating with military precision. Local aid societies knew exactly how to collect donations, package food for shipping, and coordinate with military authorities. Churches had developed liturgies that balanced celebration with mourning. Families had learned how to maintain traditions while adapting to empty chairs and shortened resources. But the soldiers' experience in 1864 was different from the year before. These weren't the eager volunteers of 1861, or even the seasoned but hopeful veterans of 1863. These were men who had seen Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. They had watched friends die in ways that defied description. They understood war in ways that no American generation ever had before. Yet their letters home from Thanksgiving 1864 reveal something remarkable. The gratitude wasn't naive or forced. It was earned, tested, refined by experience. A soldier writing from a hospital in Washington described being grateful simply to be alive, to have all his limbs, to be able to write a letter. Another soldier camped near Richmond wrote about being thankful for the letters from home, for the blanket his mother had sent, for the fact that his regiment had survived another battle relatively intact. This wasn't the easy gratitude of people who had never faced real hardship. This was the deep, complicated gratitude of people who had stared into the abyss and chosen to keep believing in something better. They were grateful for small things because they understood how easily those small things could be lost. They were grateful for each other because they had watched too many friends disappear. The home front experience in 1864 was equally complex. Families had learned to live with uncertainty as a constant companion. They had developed routines around worry, traditions around hope. Thanksgiving became a focal point for all of these emotions, a day when gratitude and grief could coexist without contradiction. Women had become the primary organizers of both family celebrations and soldier support efforts. They managed households without husbands. raised children without fathers present, and somehow still found energy to organize massive food drives for strangers in uniform. The 1864 Thanksgiving effort was largely their creation, a testament to female organizational skills and emotional resilience. The menus from 1864 show both adaptation and aspiration. Families who could afford it still prepared elaborate feasts, but they also learned to be grateful for simpler meals. Recipes appeared for making do with substitute ingredients, for stretching small amounts of meat to feed large gatherings, for creating celebration out of scarcity. Churches had developed their own traditions around wartime Thanksgiving. Services typically included prayers for soldiers, readings of names of local men who had died in service, and collections for military hospitals and orphanages. The holiday became deeply intertwined with Christian ideas about sacrifice and redemption, suffering and hope. But the most significant development in 1864 was how Thanksgiving began to shape American ideas about what the war meant. The holiday provided a framework for understanding the conflict, not just as a political struggle or even a moral crusade, but as a spiritual test. Americans were being asked to prove their worthiness of their blessings, to demonstrate their commitment to their ideals, to show that they could maintain their humanity even in the midst of inhumanity. This interpretation gave meaning to sacrifices that might otherwise have seemed senseless. A mother who had lost her son could understand his death as part of a larger story about national redemption. A soldier facing another winter in camp could see his suffering as a contribution to something worthy of gratitude. The holiday didn't eliminate grief or fear, but it provided a context for those emotions. The African American experience of Thanksgiving during this period deserves special attention. For enslaved people in Union-occupied territory, the holiday took on meanings that white Americans could barely comprehend. They were giving thanks not just for food or safety, but for the possibility of freedom itself. Former slaves working as laborers for the Union Army often received Thanksgiving rations alongside white soldiers, a small but symbolically enormous gesture of recognition. The Colored Ladies Union Association organized special Thanksgiving dinners for black soldiers recovering in military hospitals. These events were segregated, reflecting the racial limitations of even progressive Union policies, but they were also celebrations of black agency and community. African American women took pride in caring for African American soldiers, in creating spaces where black men in uniform could be honored and celebrated. Black soldiers writing home about Thanksgiving often mentioned not just the food or the festivities, but the simple fact of being treated as men worthy of celebration. For people who had been considered property just years or months before, sitting down to a Thanksgiving dinner as American soldiers was itself a revolutionary act. The Confederate experience during this same period was markedly different. By 1864, the Confederate economy was collapsing, supply lines were breaking down, and civilian morale was cracking. Jefferson Davis continued to proclaim occasional days of Thanksgiving tied to military victories, but those victories were becoming rarer and more costly. Confederate soldiers' diaries from late 1864 reveal a very different relationship to gratitude and celebration. They wrote about being grateful for scraps of food, for surviving another day, for letters from home that proved their families were still alive. Their Thanksgiving was grimmer, more desperate, but in its own way equally profound. Southern civilians faced their own challenges in maintaining holiday traditions. Basic ingredients were unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Families had been scattered by military action and economic collapse. The elaborate Thanksgiving celebrations promoted in Northern magazines seemed like fantasies from another world. Yet even in the Confederacy, people found ways to observe the holiday. They gathered in smaller groups, shared whatever food they could find, and tried to maintain some sense of normal life. Their celebrations were necessarily more modest, but the impulse to give thanks persisted even under the most difficult circumstances. The contrast between Union and Confederate Thanksgiving experiences in 1864 illustrates how the holiday had become intertwined with larger questions about American identity and purpose. Union celebrations implicitly argued that America was worth preserving, that its ideals could survive even the worst crisis. Confederate observances suggested a different vision of American identity, one that could exist independently of the federal Union. Both sides used Thanksgiving rhetoric to justify their cause and maintain morale, but the Union version proved more durable and more appealing to later generations. Lincoln's vision of a grateful but penitent nation, seeking divine guidance for healing and reconciliation, resonated with Americans who were exhausted by conflict and eager for reunion. The practical impact of Thanksgiving celebrations on military morale cannot be overstated. Officers reported that soldiers who received Thanksgiving packages from home showed improved discipline and fighting spirit for weeks afterward. The holiday provided psychological benefits that were as valuable as any military supplies. Medical personnel noted that wounded soldiers who participated in Thanksgiving celebrations recovered faster and had better attitudes than those who didn't. The combination of better food, community celebration, and connection to home created healing environments that modern medicine would recognize as holistic therapy. The holiday also served important functions for military discipline and unit cohesion. Shared celebrations created bonds between soldiers from different backgrounds and regions. Men who might have had little in common in civilian life found themselves united in gratitude for survival and hope for the future. As winter approached in 1864, both armies settled into positions that everyone understood might determine the war's outcome. Grant was tightening his grip around Petersburg and Richmond. Sherman was preparing for his march to the sea. The end was visible, though still months away, and that visibility gave Thanksgiving 1864 a different quality than previous wartime celebrations. For the first time since the war began, Americans could realistically imagine peace. They could begin to think about what they would be grateful for when the fighting finally stopped. This forward-looking gratitude was different from the desperate thankfulness of earlier years. It was gratitude seasoned with hope, tempered by experience, but genuinely optimistic about the future. The Thanksgiving celebrations of 1864 became a kind of dress rehearsal for peacetime. Families and communities experimented with traditions they hoped to maintain after the war ended. Soldiers talked about the Thanksgiving dinners they would share with their families once they came home. The holiday became a bridge between the world they had lost and the world they hoped to create. But even as Americans looked toward peace, they understood that the gratitude they had learned during wartime would be different from anything they had known before. They had discovered that thankfulness could coexist with sorrow, that celebration could acknowledge loss, that hope could be strengthened rather than weakened by experience with suffering. This mature understanding of gratitude would become one of the Civil War's most important legacies. Americans had learned to be grateful not just for good things, but for the strength to endure bad things. They had learned to find reasons for thankfulness even in the midst of crisis. They had discovered that gratitude could be a choice, a discipline, a form of courage. The Thanksgiving tradition that emerged from the Civil War was more complex and more durable than anything Sarah Hale had originally envisioned. Her dream of a national holiday had been realized, but in ways that none of the early advocates could have predicted. The holiday had been forged in conflict, shaped by suffering, and strengthened by the very trials that might have destroyed it. As 1864 drew to a close, and Americans prepared for what many hoped would be their final wartime Thanksgiving, the holiday had become something unprecedented in American culture, a tradition that was simultaneously deeply personal and broadly national, intensely spiritual and thoroughly practical, rooted in the past but oriented toward the future, toward the future. The holiday they were shaping would carry forward lessons that no peacetime celebration could have taught. Gratitude earned through genuine hardship, hope maintained despite overwhelming evidence for despair, and community forged in the crucible of shared sacrifice. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were lived experiences, written in the letters soldiers sent home and carved into the hearts of families who had learned to find joy in the smallest mercies. But to truly understand what Thanksgiving meant to Civil War Americans, we need to step inside their actual celebrations. Picture yourself in a Union military hospital in Washington, D.C. on Thanksgiving Day, 1864. The wards smell of carbolic acid and human suffering, but today something different mingles with those harsh odors. The rich aroma of roasted turkey, the sweet scent of pumpkin pie, the warm fragrance of fresh bread baked by volunteers who arrived before dawn. The wounded soldiers, some missing limbs, others bearing scars that will never fully heal, prop themselves up in their beds as civilian volunteers arrange makeshift tables between the rows of cots. These aren't professional caterers or paid staff. They're ordinary citizens who spent their own money, their own time, their own emotional energy to create this moment of celebration for strangers who happen to wear the same uniform. A young private from Indiana, barely 18 years old, stares at a piece of turkey on his plate with something approaching reverence. He hasn't tasted anything like this since he left his family's farm 14 months ago. But more than the food, what moves him to tears is the elderly woman sitting beside his bed, cutting his meat because his right arm is still healing from a bullet wound received at Cold Harbor. She tells him about her own son who died at Antietam and how feeding soldiers has become her way of honoring his memory. This scene was repeated in dozens of hospitals, hundreds of military camps, and thousands of homes across the Union. Thanksgiving had become more than a holiday. It had become a language for expressing things that were too complex for ordinary words. Love for people you'd never met. Gratitude for survival that felt both deserved and miraculous. Hope for a future that seemed simultaneously inevitable and impossibly distant. The logistics of creating these celebrations reveals something remarkable about American society during its greatest crisis. Despite fighting the largest war in the nation's history, despite economic disruption and political upheaval, civilian communities still had the organizational capacity and emotional energy to stage elaborate celebrations for hundreds of thousands of soldiers scattered across a continent. This wasn't government-mandated or centrally coordinated. It was grassroots, voluntary, and driven by a shared understanding that some things were more important than convenience or comfort. Consider the journey of a single turkey from a farm in Ohio to a military camp in Tennessee. A farming family decides to donate their prize bird to the soldier relief effort. They slaughter and clean it, pack it in a wooden crate with ice and sawdust, and transport it by wagon to the nearest railroad depot. There, volunteers from the local aid society combine it with dozens of other birds in a refrigerated railroad car that's been donated by the rail company for the occasion. The train travels for 3 days, stopping at stations where more volunteers check the ice, add more donated food, and send telegrams ahead to coordinate arrival times. At the destination, military quartermasters work with civilian volunteers to distribute the food to various units, ensuring that even the smallest detachments receive something special. The turkey that began its journey on an Ohio farm ends up feeding a dozen soldiers who are camped in muddy trenches 50 miles south of Nashville. But here's what makes this story remarkable. That same process was happening simultaneously for thousands of turkeys, hundreds of thousands of pies, countless barrels of cranberry sauce and vegetables. It represented a level of civilian organization and commitment that would have been impressive in peacetime and was absolutely extraordinary during the largest military conflict in American history. The soldiers who received these gifts understood their significance in ways that go beyond simple gratitude for better food. A sergeant from Massachusetts wrote to his family describing the moment when wagons loaded with Thanksgiving supplies arrived at his camp near Petersburg. "When we saw those packages with our names written in the careful handwriting of people we'd never met," he wrote, "we understood that we weren't just fighting for the Union. We were fighting for people who cared enough about strangers to spend their last dollar on turkey and pie for men they'd never see again. This connection between the home front and the battlefield became one of Thanksgiving's most important functions during the war years. The holiday created a bridge across the vast distances that separated soldiers from their families, a shared experience that made separation more bearable and sacrifice more meaningful. A mother baking pies for her son's regiment wasn't just cooking. She was participating in the same celebration her son would experience hundreds of miles away. A soldier sharing turkey with his messmates wasn't just eating. He was connected to the kitchens and dining rooms where his loved ones were gathered. The timing of these celebrations was crucial in ways that modern Americans might not fully appreciate. November marked the beginning of winter, traditionally the season when military campaigns slowed or stopped entirely. For soldiers, this meant months of camp life, of waiting, of enduring cold and boredom and homesickness without the distraction of active combat. Thanksgiving provided a psychological anchor, a reason to believe that the waiting had purpose, that the suffering would eventually end. For civilians, November represented the harvest season, the time when farm families traditionally took stock of the year's blessings and challenges. In wartime, this accounting was necessarily more complex. Yes, the corn had grown and the apples had ripened, but the young men who should have been helping with the harvest were camped in Virginia or marching through Georgia. The abundance of the land was shadowed by the absence of those who had always shared in celebrating it. Yet families found ways to make these contradictions meaningful. They set empty places at their tables, not as symbols of loss, but as affirmations of hope. They saved portions of the feast to send to soldiers, making the absent present through the act of sharing. They told stories about missing family members, keeping their voices alive in family memory, even when their physical presence was impossible. Churches played particularly important roles in helping communities navigate these emotional complexities. Ministers preached sermons that acknowledged the difficulty of giving thanks during wartime while affirming that gratitude remained both possible and necessary. They led prayers for soldiers that balanced requests for safety with acceptance of divine will. They organized charitable activities that channeled grief and worry into productive action. The theological challenges of wartime Thanksgiving were substantial. How do you thank God for blessings while acknowledging that your nation is engaged in killing on an unprecedented scale? How do you pray for victory while recognizing that victory means death and suffering for other Americans? How do you maintain faith in divine providence while watching young men die in ways that seem to serve no comprehensible purpose? Different denominations answered these questions in different ways, but most found common ground in emphasizing themes of sacrifice, redemption, and ultimate divine justice. The war was understood as a test, a purification process that would ultimately make America worthy of its blessings. Suffering was meaningful because it served larger purposes. Death was tragic, but not senseless, because it contributed to national rebirth. These theological frameworks provided comfort and meaning, but they also created pressure. If the war was a divine test, then Americans had to prove themselves worthy of passing it. If suffering served redemptive purposes, then it had to be endured with patience and grace. If death had meaning, then the living had obligations to ensure that meaning was realized through their actions. Thanksgiving became a crucial part of meeting these spiritual challenges. The holiday provided a regular opportunity for communities to affirm their faith, demonstrate their worthiness, and recommit themselves to the causes they believed justified their sacrifices. It was both celebration and consecration, both gratitude and rededication. The African American experience of these wartime Thanksgivings adds another layer of complexity to the story. For free blacks in the North, the holiday represented an opportunity to demonstrate their full participation in American society. They organized their own relief efforts for black soldiers, hosted their own celebrations, and used the occasion to affirm their patriotism and their stake in the Union cause. for newly freed slaves in occupied Confederate territory. Thanksgiving took on meanings that were almost impossible for others to comprehend. They were giving thanks not just for food or safety, but for freedom itself, for the right to make choices about their own lives, for the possibility that their children might grow up as citizens rather than property. Their celebrations were often modest in terms of material resources, but profound in terms of spiritual significance. Frederick Douglass, the great African-American orator and writer, spoke about Thanksgiving during the war years as a holiday that finally had meaning for his people. For the first time in American history, he argued, Black Americans could participate in National Thanksgiving not as outsiders looking in, but as full participants in the struggle to define what America would become. Their gratitude was earned through their own sacrifice and service, not granted as a privilege by others. The military experience of Thanksgiving reveals how the holiday helped create new forms of American identity that transcended regional and class distinctions. In military camps, men from different states, different backgrounds, different social classes found themselves sharing meals and celebrations that created bonds stronger than their differences. A farmer's son from Iowa might find himself sharing turkey with a factory worker from Massachusetts and a shopkeeper's son from Ohio, united by their common service and their shared gratitude for survival. These military celebrations also created new traditions that would influence civilian Thanksgiving celebrations for generations to come. Soldiers developed rituals around honoring fallen comrades, around expressing gratitude for military friendships, around acknowledging the unique bonds created by shared danger. When they returned home after the war, they brought these traditions with them, enriching civilian celebrations with military customs and military understanding of sacrifice. The impact of Civil War Thanksgiving on American women deserves particular attention. The war had thrust women into public roles that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. They organized massive relief efforts, managed farms and businesses in the absence of men, and took on responsibilities that challenged traditional gender roles. Thanksgiving became a showcase for these new capabilities. The women who organized food drives for soldiers, who managed complex logistics across multiple states, who coordinated with military authorities and civilian volunteers, were demonstrating skills and taking on responsibilities that proved their capacity for public leadership. The success of their efforts provided evidence that women could handle large-scale organizational challenges, that they could work effectively in mixed-gender environments, and that they could take initiative in addressing national problems. These experiences would have long-term consequences for women's roles in American society. The organizational skills developed during wartime relief efforts would be applied to post-war reform movements. The confidence gained through successful public action would support arguments for women's expanded political participation. The networks created during Thanksgiving organizing would become the foundation for women's clubs and charitable organizations that would shape American social policy for decades. The children's experience of Civil War Thanksgiving is particularly poignant. Many had never known peacetime, had no memory of family celebrations that included fathers and older brothers, had grown up with absence and worry as normal parts of life. For them, the elaborate Thanksgiving celebrations organized by adults represented glimpses of a different kind of world. A world where families could gather without fear, where abundance didn't have to be shared with distant strangers, where celebration didn't have to be shadowed by mourning. Yet these children also developed a mature understanding of gratitude that their peacetime counterparts might never achieve. They learned to be thankful for letters from absent family members, for news that battles had been survived, for small luxuries that made difficult lives more bearable. They understood that celebration was something you created through effort and intention, not something that simply happened because of favorable circumstances. The educational impact of these childhood experiences would influence American culture for generations. Children who learned to find reasons for gratitude during the nation's greatest crisis would carry those lessons into peacetime. They would teach their own children that thankfulness was a choice, not a response to circumstances. They would understand that community celebration required individual sacrifice, that abundance was something to be shared rather than hoarded, that hope could be maintained even in the most difficult circumstances. As 1864 moved toward 1865, Americans began to sense that the war might actually end within their lifetimes. The military situation was improving for the Union. Political pressure was building for negotiated settlement, and even die-hard Confederates were beginning to acknowledge that their cause might not prevail. This growing possibility of peace gave the fourth wartime Thanksgiving a different quality than previous celebrations. For the first time since 1861, Americans could realistically imagine future Thanksgivings that wouldn't be overshadowed by active warfare. They could begin to think about what peace would mean, what they would be grateful for when the shooting finally stopped, how they would rebuild lives and communities that had been disrupted by 4 years of unprecedented conflict. But they also understood that peace would bring its own challenges. How do you reintegrate soldiers who had spent years learning to kill? How do you rebuild communities that had lost substantial portions of their young men? How do you maintain the sense of national purpose that had sustained the war effort without the unifying enemy that had made that purpose clear? How do you preserve the lessons learned through suffering without the suffering that had taught them? These questions would define the post-war period, but they were already shaping the way Americans thought about Thanksgiving in late 1864. The holiday was evolving from a wartime necessity into a peacetime tradition, from an emergency measure designed to maintain morale into a permanent institution, designed to preserve memory and maintain values. The Thanksgiving celebrations of late 1864 became laboratories for experimenting with what peacetime gratitude might look like. Families and communities tried different ways of honoring military service while celebrating civilian life. They experimented with rituals that acknowledged sacrifice without dwelling on suffering. They practiced forms of celebration that could include rather than exclude, that could heal rather than divide, that could build rather than merely preserve. These experiments would prove crucial when peace finally came. The traditions developed during wartime would provide frameworks for peacetime celebration. The organizational skills developed for supporting soldiers would be applied to supporting veterans and their families. The understanding of gratitude developed through crisis would enrich appreciation of normal life. As winter deepened and both armies settled into what everyone hoped would be their final winter camps, the meaning of Thanksgiving continued to evolve. It was becoming less about the specific circumstances of war and more about the enduring values that war had tested and refined. Gratitude, community, sacrifice, hope, resilience, compassion. These weren't wartime virtues. They were human virtues that war had revealed and strengthened. The soldiers writing letters home from those winter camps weren't just describing military life. They were articulating a philosophy of gratitude that had been forged in the crucible of unprecedented conflict. They were grateful for survival, yes, but also for friendship, for purpose, for the opportunity to serve something larger than themselves. They were grateful for the chance to test their courage, to discover their strength, to prove their commitment to their ideals. This mature understanding of gratitude would become one of the Civil War generation's most important gifts to future Americans. They had learned that thankfulness wasn't dependent on favorable circumstances, that celebration could coexist with sorrow, that hope could be strengthened rather than weakened by experience with hardship. They had discovered that gratitude was not a feeling, but a choice, not a response, but a discipline, not a luxury, but a necessity. The winter of 1864 to 1865 brought a different kind of anticipation to American Thanksgiving tables. After 4 years of war, the rhythm of military campaigns had become as familiar as the changing seasons. Spring meant renewed fighting. Summer brought the bloodiest battles. Autumn offered temporary respite, and winter meant waiting. But this winter felt different. Letters from the front carried new undertones of hope, and even the most cautious families began to whisper about what peace might look like. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman had completed his devastating march to the sea, reaching Savannah in December and effectively cutting the Confederacy in half. General Ulysses Grant maintained his stranglehold around Petersburg and Richmond, slowly tightening the noose around the Confederate capital. The mathematical reality was becoming undeniable. The Confederacy was running out of men, supplies, and territory. For the first time since Fort Sumter, Americans could imagine a specific date when the killing might actually stop. But victory, when it came, would be bittersweet. The numbers alone told a story of unprecedented loss. Over 600,000 Americans had died in uniform, more than would perish in all other American wars combined until Vietnam. Entire communities had been emptied of young men. Families had been shattered by losses that no previous generation had experienced. The victory that everyone could now envision would come at a price that no one had imagined paying when the war began. This awareness shaped the Thanksgiving celebrations of early 1865 in profound ways. There was gratitude, yes, but it was gratitude seasoned with grief. There was hope, but hope tempered by the knowledge of what had been lost to achieve it. There was celebration, but celebration that acknowledged absence as much as presence. Americans were learning that victory and tragedy could occupy the same space, that triumph could coexist with mourning. The Confederate experience during these final months reveals how deeply Thanksgiving had become embedded in American consciousness, even among those who rejected Lincoln's authority. Despite their political opposition to the Union, many Southerners continued to observe Thanksgiving traditions, though they adapted them to their own circumstances and beliefs. Confederate General Robert E. Lee wrote to his wife about the importance of maintaining gratitude, even in defeat, of finding reasons to give thanks, even when facing the collapse of everything they had fought to preserve. Southern families gathered for modest Thanksgiving meals that bore little resemblance to the elaborate feasts promoted in Northern magazines. They gave thanks for smaller mercies, for letters from soldier sons, for neighbors who shared scarce food, for houses that hadn't been burned by passing armies. Their gratitude was harder won and perhaps more precious because it had been extracted from genuinely desperate circumstances. The contrast between Northern and Southern Thanksgiving experiences in early 1865 illustrates how the holiday had become a lens through which Americans examined their deepest beliefs about providence, justice, and national destiny. Northerners increasingly saw their approaching victory as divine vindication of their cause, proof that God had blessed their struggle against slavery and secession. Their thanksgiving carried undertones of righteousness, of moral triumph earned through righteous suffering. Southerners faced more complex theological challenges. How do you give thanks when your cause is failing? How do you maintain faith in divine providence when providence seems to be working against you? How do you find meaning in sacrifice when that sacrifice appears to have been in vain? Some found comfort in believing that God was testing their faith through adversity. Others began to question whether their cause had been blessed by heaven after all. These different interpretations of divine will would have lasting consequences for how Americans understood their history and their destiny. Northern victory would be remembered as providential, as evidence that America was indeed a chosen nation blessed by heaven when it acted righteously. Southern defeat would be reinterpreted as noble failure, as tragic but honorable resistance to overwhelming odds. Both narratives would shape American Thanksgiving traditions for generations to come. The military experience of these final months reveals how soldiers on both sides were grappling with questions that went far beyond immediate survival. Union soldiers wrote home about their eagerness to finish the job, to complete the work they had started 4 years earlier. But they also wrote about their sadness at what victory was costing, their recognition that winning the war would not automatically heal the wounds it had created. Confederate soldiers faced even more difficult psychological challenges. Many continued to fight with desperate courage, even as they recognized their cause was doomed. They wrote about fighting for honor rather than victory, about maintaining their integrity even in defeat. Their Thanksgiving, when they could manage it at all, focused on personal rather than political blessings, friendship, courage, the opportunity to serve with honor even in a losing cause. The African American military experience during these final months was particularly complex. Black soldiers understood that Union victory meant not just national reunion, but personal liberation for millions of enslaved people. Their thanksgiving carried weight that white soldiers could barely comprehend. They were giving thanks for the approaching end of an institution that had defined American society for 2.5 centuries. Frederick Douglass spoke about the 1865 Thanksgiving as potentially the first truly American Thanksgiving, the first time the holiday could be celebrated by all Americans as free people. The irony wasn't lost on him that a holiday proclaimed by Abraham Lincoln in the midst of war might finally achieve its promise of national unity only through the complete victory of one section over another. The experience of newly freed slaves during this period adds another dimension to the Thanksgiving story. For people who had spent their entire lives in bondage, the approaching Union victory represented a transformation that was almost impossible to comprehend. They were about to become not just free people, but American citizens with rights and opportunities their grandparents could never have imagined. Their Thanksgiving celebrations, often held in contraband camps or occupied southern territories, had a quality of religious revival. They were thanking God, not just for freedom, but for the chance to prove their worthiness of freedom. They understood that emancipation was only the beginning of a longer struggle for full equality, but they also recognized it as the most important first step. The organizational machinery that had made wartime Thanksgiving possible was beginning to turn toward post-war challenges. The same women's organizations that had collected food for soldiers began planning for the needs of returning veterans. The same communities that had maintained morale during the war's darkest moments began preparing for the challenges of reconstruction and reunion. These preparations revealed both the strengths and limitations of wartime unity. Americans had proven they could mobilize extraordinary resources for extraordinary challenges. They had demonstrated that civilians could sustain military efforts through voluntary action and community organization. They had shown that shared sacrifice could create bonds that transcended regional and class distinctions. But they had also learned that unity forged in crisis might not automatically survive the end of crisis. The common enemy that had united Northerners was disappearing. The shared purpose that had sustained civilian sacrifice was achieving its goals. The question facing American communities was whether they could maintain wartime levels of cooperation and commitment when the immediate need for them had passed. Thanksgiving became a test case for this broader challenge. Could a holiday that had been shaped by war serve the needs of peace? Could traditions that had emerged from crisis provide guidance for normal times? Could gratitude that had been learned through suffering enrich appreciation of ordinary blessings? The answers to these questions would determine not just the future of Thanksgiving, but the future of American civic culture more broadly. The war had created new expectations for what communities could accomplish when they worked together. It had demonstrated that ordinary people could organize extraordinary efforts when they shared common purposes. It had proven that voluntary action could achieve results that government mandate alone could not. But sustaining these achievements in peacetime would require different skills and different motivations. Wartime urgency would need to be replaced by peacetime persistence. Crisis-driven cooperation would need to evolve into routine civic engagement. The dramatic gestures that had sustained morale during military campaigns would need to give way to the smaller, steadier efforts required for long-term social health. The Thanksgiving celebrations of spring 1865 became laboratories for experimenting with these transitions. Communities that had organized massive food drives for distant soldiers began organizing smaller efforts for local needs. Families that had maintained hope through military crisis began adapting those same emotional skills to civilian challenges. Churches that had provided spiritual comfort during wartime began developing peacetime ministries that could serve different but equally important needs. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, fundamentally changed the meaning of American Thanksgiving. Suddenly, gratitude could include peace as well as victory. Americans could give thanks not just for military success, but for the end of killing, for the possibility of reunion, for the chance to rebuild rather than destroy. But Lincoln's assassination, just 5 days later, reminded everyone that peace would bring its own tragedies and challenges. The president who had proclaimed Thanksgiving as a national holiday, who had guided the nation through its greatest crisis, who had articulated a vision of reunion based on malice toward none and charity for all, was dead. His vision of reconstruction would have to be carried forward by others who might not share his wisdom or his compassion. The first peacetime Thanksgiving in November 1865 was unlike anything Americans had experienced before. There was profound relief that the killing had finally stopped. There was joy at the return of surviving soldiers to their families and communities. There was satisfaction in Union victory and in the end of slavery. But there was also deep sadness for all that had been lost, uncertainty about what peace would bring, and recognition that healing the wounds of war would be a longer and more difficult process than anyone had anticipated. Veterans returning home brought with them not just military experiences, but new understanding of gratitude forged in extreme circumstances. They had learned to be thankful for survival, for friendship, for the chance to serve causes larger than themselves. They had discovered that gratitude could be a choice rather than just a feeling, a discipline rather than just an emotion, a source of strength rather than just an expression of satisfaction. These veterans would shape American Thanksgiving traditions for the rest of the 19th century. Their understanding of sacrifice would influence how families remembered absent loved ones. Their experience with community forged under pressure would inform civilian efforts at cooperation and mutual aid. Their knowledge of how gratitude could sustain hope during dark times would enrich American spiritual and cultural traditions. The challenge facing post-war America was how to preserve the lessons learned through suffering without requiring future generations to learn them through similar suffering. How could the gratitude earned through crisis be maintained during prosperity? How could the community bonds forged in war survive the individualism of peace? How could the sense of national purpose that had sustained the Union cause find expression in civilian pursuits? Thanksgiving became one answer to these questions. The holiday provided a regular opportunity for Americans to remember what they had learned about gratitude, sacrifice, and community. It offered a framework for maintaining wartime values in peacetime contexts. It created space for acknowledging both blessings received and prices paid for those blessings. The Thanksgiving Proclamation issued by President Andrew Johnson in October 1865 reflected these complex realities. Johnson acknowledged the end of civil war and the restoration of peace, but he also recognized that much work remained to be done. He called for gratitude tempered by humility, for celebration balanced by remembrance of sacrifice, for thanksgiving that included commitment to completing the work that war had begun. The response to Johnson's proclamation revealed how deeply Thanksgiving had embedded itself in American culture during the war years. Communities across the country organized celebrations that combined traditional elements with new rituals developed during the conflict. Churches held services that thanked God for peace, while honoring those who had died to achieve it. Families gathered for meals that celebrated reunion while acknowledging empty chairs. The food served at these first peacetime Thanksgiving celebrations reflected both abundance and memory. Families who could afford elaborate feasts prepared them with special gratitude for the ability to celebrate without fear of disruption by military action. But they also maintained some of the simpler traditions that had emerged during wartime, recognizing that modest celebrations could be more meaningful than extravagant ones. The organizational patterns established during wartime Thanksgiving efforts continued into peacetime, but with modified purposes. Instead of collecting food for distant soldiers, communities organized charitable efforts for local veterans and their families. Instead of maintaining morale for military campaigns, they focused on supporting reconstruction and reunion efforts. The skills remained the same, but the applications changed. Women who had managed complex logistics for military support discovered that those same skills were valuable for peacetime civic engagement. They organized veterans' relief efforts, supported education initiatives, and managed charitable programs that addressed the ongoing needs created by 4 years of war. Their wartime Thanksgiving work had prepared them for expanded public roles that would define women's civic engagement for decades to come. Children who had grown up during the war years brought unique perspectives to peacetime Thanksgiving celebrations. They had learned that gratitude was something you worked for rather than something you automatically received. They understood that celebration required effort and intention, that community was something you built rather than something that simply existed, that thankfulness was a choice rather than just a response to circumstances. These children would carry these lessons into adulthood, shaping American culture in ways that extended far beyond any single holiday. They would teach their own children that abundance was something to be shared, that blessings carried obligations, that gratitude was most meaningful when it acknowledged both gifts received and prices paid for those gifts. The theological implications of peacetime Thanksgiving were as complex as the social and cultural ones. Ministers who had preached about divine testing and national purification during wartime now faced the challenge of interpreting divine blessing and national victory. How do you maintain humility in triumph? How do you acknowledge divine grace without becoming self-righteous? How do you give thanks for victory without demonizing the defeated? Different denominations answered these questions in different ways, but most found common ground in emphasizing themes of reconciliation and healing. The war had been necessary to end slavery and preserve the Union, but peace required different virtues: forgiveness, patience, and commitment to rebuilding rather than punishing. Thanksgiving sermons began to focus on these peacetime challenges, using the holiday to promote reunion rather than division. The African American experience of peacetime Thanksgiving was particularly significant. For the first time in American history, all Black Americans could participate in the national holiday as free people. Their celebrations combined gratitude for emancipation with commitment to proving their worthiness of freedom. They understood that legal liberation was only the beginning of a longer struggle for full equality, but they also recognized it as the most important victory in American history. Black churches organized Thanksgiving celebrations that combined traditional religious observance with explicitly political messages about citizenship and civil rights. Black families gathered for meals that celebrated not just abundance, but the right to make choices about their own lives. Black communities used the holiday to demonstrate their full participation in American civic life. The Southern white experience of peacetime Thanksgiving was more complicated. Many Southerners struggled with participating in a holiday proclaimed by Lincoln and associated with Union victory. Some refused to observe it at all, maintaining their own regional traditions instead. Others participated reluctantly, viewing it as an imposed Northern custom rather than a genuinely American tradition. But gradually, many Southerners began to find ways to make Thanksgiving their own. They emphasized themes that resonated with their experience: gratitude for survival, appreciation for family and community, thankfulness for the end of violence and destruction. They developed their own interpretations of what the holiday meant, focusing on personal and local blessings rather than national political outcomes. This Southern adaptation of Thanksgiving reveals how the holiday was continuing to evolve in response to different regional experiences and perspectives. The basic framework established during the war years proved flexible enough to accommodate different interpretations while maintaining its essential character. Americans could give thanks for different things while still participating in the same national ritual. The economic dimensions of post-war Thanksgiving celebrations reflected both recovery and transformation. The war had disrupted traditional agricultural patterns, created new industrial capabilities, and shifted population centers in ways that would permanently change American society. Thanksgiving menus began to reflect these changes, incorporating new foods made possible by improved transportation and industrial food processing. But the holiday also maintained connections to older, more traditional ways of life. Families continued to prepare foods that connected them to their regional and cultural heritage. They maintained rituals that honored ancestors and preserved memory. They used the occasion to teach children about family history and cultural values. This combination of innovation and tradition would become one of Thanksgiving's most enduring characteristics. The holiday proved capable of adapting to changing circumstances while preserving essential meanings. It could incorporate new elements without losing its basic identity. It could serve different purposes for different people while maintaining its character as a shared national experience. The first decade after the Civil War established Thanksgiving as a permanent part of American civic culture. The holiday had survived the test of war, had proven its value during the nation's greatest crisis, and had demonstrated its ability to evolve in response to changing circumstances. It had become more than just a day of celebration. It had become an institution that helped define what it meant to be American. The lessons learned during the Civil War years would continue to influence Thanksgiving celebrations for generations to come. Americans had discovered that gratitude could be a source of strength during difficult times. That celebration could provide hope during dark periods. That community could be built through shared commitment to common values. These discoveries would prove valuable not just for future wars, but for all the challenges that peacetime would bring. The Civil War generation had given America more than just military victory and political union. They had given the nation a deeper understanding of gratitude, a more mature appreciation of blessing, and a more nuanced recognition of what was worth preserving and protecting. Their Thanksgiving would become the foundation for an American tradition that would endure through prosperity and depression, through peace and war, through triumph and tragedy. As the 1860s drew to a close, Americans could look back on a decade that had transformed their nation in ways that few could have imagined when it began. They had preserved the Union, ended slavery, and created new traditions that would define American civic life for generations to come. They had learned that Thanksgiving was not just about acknowledging good fortune, but about finding meaning in sacrifice, purpose in suffering, and hope in the midst of loss. The Thanksgiving tradition that emerged from the Civil War carried forward all these lessons, wrapped in the comforting rituals of family gathering and community celebration. It honored the past while embracing the future, acknowledged loss while celebrating survival, and maintained faith while recognizing the complexity of divine providence. It had become, in the truest sense, an American institution, shaped by American experience and designed to serve American needs. But perhaps most importantly, Civil War Thanksgiving had taught Americans that gratitude was not passive but active, not automatic but chosen, not easy but necessary. The holiday required effort, demanded sacrifice, and called for commitment to values larger than individual comfort or convenience. It had become a discipline as much as a celebration, a responsibility as much as a pleasure. This understanding would prove crucial as America faced the challenges of the post-war era and beyond. The nation that had learned to give thanks in the midst of its greatest crisis would be better prepared for all the trials and triumphs that lay ahead. They had discovered that Thanksgiving was not just something you did when times were good, but something that could make times better when they were hard. The wounds of war don't heal overnight, and neither do the traditions born from them. As America stumbled into the 1870s, still nursing the scars of Reconstruction and grappling with what reunion actually meant, Thanksgiving found itself evolving once again. The holiday that had been forged in crisis now had to prove it could thrive in peace, or at least in whatever passed for peace in a nation still divided by memory, resentment, and competing visions of what America should become. Picture a family gathering in rural Pennsylvania in November 1872. The father had served with the Army of the Potomac and still wakes some nights dreaming of Antietam. The eldest son had been too young for the war, but grew up hearing every battle re-fought around the dinner table. The mother had spent 4 years organizing relief efforts and now channels that same energy into the local temperance society. They're gathered around a table that holds both abundance and absence, celebrating a holiday that means different things to each of them. For the father, Thanksgiving carries the weight of survival guilt. Why did he live when so many of his friends died? For the mother, it represents proof that civilian sacrifice had meaning, that the home front contributions mattered as much as battlefield heroics. For the son, it's a bridge to a past he never experienced but somehow inherited, a way of honoring sacrifices he didn't make for causes he's not entirely sure he understands. This complexity was playing out in millions of homes across America. The holiday that Sarah Hale had envisioned as a simple expression of national gratitude had become something far more complicated. It carried the full weight of American memory, the unresolved tensions of American identity, and the ongoing struggle to define what the war had actually accomplished. The South presented particularly thorny challenges. How do you celebrate a holiday proclaimed by Abraham Lincoln when half your family still refers to him as a tyrant? How do you give thanks for national reunion when you're not sure you wanted to be reunited in the first place? How do you participate in American traditions when you're not entirely convinced you want to be American in the way that victory demanded? Some Southern families simply refused. They maintained their own Thanksgiving traditions, often tied to harvest celebrations or religious observances that predated Lincoln's proclamation. Others participated grudgingly, viewing it as another requirement of defeat, like accepting federal currency or acknowledging federal authority. But gradually, many found ways to make the holiday their own. A plantation owner's widow in Georgia might give thanks for the survival of her family, for the preservation of her land, for the gradual return of economic stability. She might not thank God for Union victory or the end of slavery, but she could thank him for the end of killing, for the return of her surviving sons, for the simple fact that her family was still together when so many others had been shattered. This process of adaptation reveals something crucial about how traditions actually work. They don't impose themselves through force or mandate. They succeed by being flexible enough to accommodate different experiences while maintaining their essential character. Thanksgiving was becoming truly national, not because everyone celebrated it the same way, but because it was capacious enough to hold different meanings for different people. The veterans themselves played crucial roles in this process. Union veterans carried the holiday's original meanings into new communities as they migrated west or settled into civilian careers. But they also modified those meanings based on their peacetime experiences. A former soldier who became a factory worker in Detroit brought military understanding of sacrifice and community into industrial settings. A veteran who homesteaded in Kansas carried wartime lessons about gratitude and endurance into frontier challenges. Confederate veterans faced more complex challenges in adapting to peacetime Thanksgiving. Many struggled with participating in a holiday they associated with defeat and occupation, but gradually, some found ways to honor their own service while acknowledging the larger American story. They could give thanks for their own courage, for the friendships forged in battle, for the opportunity to have served causes they believed in, even if those causes had failed. Robert E. Lee himself became an unexpected advocate for this kind of reconciliation. In his final years as president of Washington College, he encouraged students and faculty to participate in national holidays as expressions of American citizenship rather than political allegiance. He argued that honoring the Union did not require dishonoring Confederate service, that Thanksgiving could acknowledge multiple forms of sacrifice and multiple sources of meaning. This perspective gradually gained traction among Confederate veterans, who were tired of fighting old battles and ready to focus on building new lives. They developed their own interpretation of Thanksgiving that honored their wartime service while accepting post-war realities. They could give thanks for survival, for honor maintained in defeat, for the opportunity to rebuild rather than continue destroying. The African American experience of post-war Thanksgiving continued to evolve in ways that reflected both progress and frustration. Legal emancipation had been achieved, but full equality remained elusive. Black families gathering for Thanksgiving in the 1870s were celebrating freedom while confronting the limitations of that freedom. They were giving thanks for opportunities their grandparents could never have imagined, while recognizing how many opportunities remained closed to them. Black churches became particularly important centers for Thanksgiving celebrations that combined gratitude with political awareness. Ministers preached sermons that thanked God for emancipation, while calling for continued struggle against discrimination. Congregations organized meals that celebrated community, while raising funds for education and civil rights activities. The holiday became both spiritual observance and political organizing tool. Frederick Douglass continued to speak about Thanksgiving as a test of American democracy. The holiday's true success, he argued, would be measured not by the enthusiasm of its celebration, but by the inclusiveness of its welcome. Could Black Americans participate as full equals? Could former slaves sit at the same tables as former masters? Could the holiday's promise of national unity become reality rather than just rhetoric? These questions were being answered differently in different places. In some northern communities, integration was becoming routine, if not always comfortable. Black and white families might attend the same church services, participate in the same charitable activities, even share some social interactions. But in much of the South, and in many northern communities as well, Thanksgiving remained segregated by custom, if not by law. The women who had organized wartime Thanksgiving efforts found themselves channeling those same skills into post-war reform movements. The organizational capabilities they had developed for supporting soldiers proved equally valuable for promoting temperance, women's suffrage, education reform, and various charitable causes. Thanksgiving became one vehicle among many for demonstrating women's public leadership capabilities. These women understood that their wartime contributions had earned them a permanent place in American public life, even if that place wasn't yet formally recognized. They had proven they could manage complex logistics, coordinate across vast distances, and mobilize communities for common purposes. The success of wartime Thanksgiving efforts provided evidence that women could handle responsibilities that traditional gender roles had reserved for men. The connection between Thanksgiving and women's expanding public roles was particularly evident in the growing movement for women's suffrage. Organizers argued that women who had sustained the home front during wartime, who had managed the civilian mobilization that made military victory possible, who had demonstrated their capacity for patriotic service, deserved full political participation. The holiday became part of their argument for citizenship rights. Children growing up in the 1870s experienced Thanksgiving differently than their parents had during the war years. For them, the holiday was becoming routine rather than extraordinary, traditional rather than innovative. They took for granted traditions that their parents had created through conscious effort and sacrifice. The elaborate meals, the family gatherings, the charitable activities, all seemed natural rather than constructed. This generational shift presented both opportunities and challenges. Children who grew up with Thanksgiving as an established tradition would pass it on to their own children without the existential questions that had shaped their parents' experience. The holiday would become more stable, more predictable, more thoroughly integrated into American culture. But it might also lose some of the urgency and meaning that had made it powerful during the crisis years. Parents who had lived through the Civil War found themselves trying to explain to their children why Thanksgiving mattered, why the traditions were worth maintaining, why gratitude required conscious effort rather than automatic response. They wanted to preserve the lessons they had learned through suffering without requiring their children to learn through similar suffering. This challenge of transmitting meaning across generations would define American Thanksgiving for decades to come. How do you maintain the depth of gratitude earned through crisis during times of prosperity? How do you preserve the sense of community forged under pressure when that pressure has been removed? How do you keep alive the understanding that celebration requires sacrifice when sacrifice is no longer obviously necessary? Different families answered these questions in different ways. Some maintained elaborate rituals that commemorated wartime experiences, setting empty places for fallen soldiers, reading letters from military service, sharing stories about civilian sacrifice. Others focused on contemporary challenges, using the holiday to support current charitable causes or address present community needs. Still others emphasized family history and cultural heritage, using Thanksgiving to teach children about their ancestors and their values. The diversity of these approaches reveals how thoroughly Thanksgiving had embedded itself in American culture. The holiday was no longer dependent on any single interpretation or any particular set of circumstances. It had become flexible enough to serve different purposes for different families, while maintaining its essential character as a celebration of gratitude and community. Religious denominations continued to play important roles in shaping Thanksgiving observances, but their emphases shifted in response to post-war concerns. During the war years, sermons had focused on themes of testing, purification, and divine judgment. In peacetime, ministers turned their attention to reconciliation, healing, and community building. The holiday became an opportunity to preach about forgiveness, charity, and the obligations that blessing imposed. Different denominations emphasized different aspects of these themes. Catholics focused on Thanksgiving as part of a broader sacramental understanding of grace and gratitude. Protestants emphasized personal relationships with God and individual responsibility for charitable action. Jews found ways to connect American Thanksgiving traditions with their own harvest festivals and expressions of gratitude to God. Each group brought its own theological perspectives to bear on the holiday, while participating in the larger national celebration. The economic dimensions of Thanksgiving continue to evolve as American prosperity gradually returned and expanded. The elaborate menus that Godey's Lady's Book had promoted during the war years became more accessible to middle-class families. Improved transportation networks made seasonal foods available across broader geographic areas. Industrial food processing began to standardize some traditional Thanksgiving ingredients, but the holiday also maintained connections to local agricultural cycles and regional food traditions. Families continued to prepare dishes that reflected their cultural heritage and geographic location. Southern tables featured different foods than northern ones. Immigrant families adapted their traditional recipes to incorporate American ingredients and customs. The holiday became a showcase for American diversity as much as American unity. The Western expansion that accelerated after the Civil War brought Thanksgiving to new territories and new populations. Miners in Colorado, ranchers in Montana, farmers in Kansas, all found ways to observe the holiday despite challenging circumstances and isolated locations. Their celebrations were often modest compared to established Eastern traditions, but they maintained the essential elements, gathering with whatever community was available, sharing whatever food could be managed, expressing gratitude for survival and opportunity. These frontier celebrations reveal how adaptable Thanksgiving traditions had become. The holiday didn't require elaborate menus or formal ceremonies. It needed only the intention to gather, to share, and to acknowledge blessings received. A group of cowboys sharing canned beans around a campfire could observe Thanksgiving as meaningfully as a wealthy family enjoying turkey and wine in their dining room. Native American responses to Thanksgiving present one of the most complex aspects of the holiday's expansion. For many tribes, the American celebration coincided uncomfortably with their own harvest traditions and seasonal observances. Some saw it as another example of cultural imposition, another way that American expansion threatened their traditional ways of life. Others found ways to adapt the holiday to their own purposes and perspectives. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, for example, had their own ancient traditions of giving thanks for harvests and seasonal cycles. They could participate in American Thanksgiving while maintaining their distinct cultural identity. Plains tribes faced greater challenges, as their traditional ways of life were being systematically destroyed by westward expansion and government policy. For them, finding reasons for Thanksgiving required considerable spiritual and emotional resilience. Individual Native Americans, who had been educated in government or missionary schools, often struggled with how to relate to Thanksgiving and other American traditions. They had been taught to abandon their tribal customs and adopt American ways, but they also experienced the discrimination and marginalization that limited their full acceptance into American society. The holiday became another arena where questions of identity, belonging, and cultural authenticity played out. Chinese immigrants on the West Coast faced similar challenges. They had their own traditions of seasonal celebration and gratitude, but they also encountered hostility and exclusion that made participation in American customs difficult and sometimes dangerous. Some found ways to observe Thanksgiving within their own communities, adapting American elements to Chinese traditions. Others remained largely separate from American celebrations, maintaining their own cultural practices instead. The growing diversity of American society in the post-war decades tested Thanksgiving's capacity to serve as a truly national holiday. Could a celebration that had emerged from specific historical circumstances and cultural traditions accommodate the full range of American experiences? Could immigrants and minorities find meaningful ways to participate? Could the holiday evolve to reflect America's increasing complexity while maintaining its essential character? These questions were being answered through countless individual and family decisions about how to observe the holiday. Each adaptation, each modification, each creative synthesis contributed to the ongoing evolution of American Thanksgiving traditions. The holiday was becoming more inclusive, not through official mandate, but through the accumulated choices of people who wanted to participate in American civic life while maintaining their own cultural identities. By the mid-1870s, Thanksgiving had achieved a stability and legitimacy that would have seemed impossible during the crisis years of the early 1860s. The holiday had survived the test of war, had proven its value during the nation's greatest trial, and had demonstrated its ability to adapt to changing circumstances. It had become more than just an annual celebration. It had become an institution that helped define American civic culture. The success of Civil War Thanksgiving had established patterns that would influence American holiday celebrations for generations to come. The combination of family gathering and community service, of personal gratitude and national reflection, of traditional observance and contemporary adaptation, all became standard features of American civic celebrations. The organizational skills developed for wartime Thanksgiving efforts provided models for peacetime charitable activities and community mobilization. But perhaps most importantly, the Civil War generation had established Thanksgiving as a holiday that acknowledged complexity rather than avoiding it. Their celebrations recognized that gratitude could coexist with grief, that blessing often came at great cost, that community required conscious effort and sacrifice. They had created a tradition that was mature enough to handle difficult emotions and complicated circumstances. This understanding would prove crucial as America faced the challenges of the Gilded Age and beyond. The rapid industrialization, massive immigration, and growing inequality of the late 19th century would test American institutions and values in new ways. The Thanksgiving tradition that had been forged during the Civil War provided a framework for maintaining community and meaning during periods of rapid change and social disruption. The veterans who had created wartime Thanksgiving were aging, but their influence on American culture was just beginning. Their children and grandchildren would carry forward the lessons they had learned about gratitude, sacrifice, and community. The holiday traditions they had established would provide stability and continuity as America transformed itself from a largely agricultural society into an industrial and urban nation. The women who had organized civilian support for wartime Thanksgiving efforts were applying those same skills to peacetime reform movements that would reshape American society. The African Americans who had celebrated their first Thanksgiving as free people were using the holiday as one vehicle among many for asserting their full citizenship rights. The immigrants who were adapting Thanksgiving traditions to their own cultural backgrounds were contributing to the ongoing evolution of American civic culture. All of these developments were rooted in the fundamental insight that the Civil War generation had gained through their Thanksgiving experiences. That gratitude was not passive, but active, not automatic, but chosen, not easy, but necessary. They had learned that meaningful celebration required effort and sacrifice, that true community demanded conscious commitment to shared values, that lasting traditions needed to be flexible enough to accommodate change while maintaining their essential character. These lessons would prove invaluable as 19th century America gave way to 20th century America, as the nation that had been saved by civil war prepared to play increasingly important roles on the world stage. The Thanksgiving tradition that had helped hold the Union together during its greatest crisis would help America navigate the new challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The story of Civil War Thanksgiving was far from over. It was still being written in every family gathering, every community celebration, every individual choice to find reasons for gratitude despite difficult circumstances. The holiday had become a living tradition, constantly evolving, but rooted in the hard-won wisdom of a generation that had learned to give thanks in the midst of unprecedented trial. Their legacy was not just the establishment of a national holiday, but the creation of a model for how Americans could maintain hope and community during dark times. They had shown that Thanksgiving was possible, even when the reasons for it were not obvious, that celebration could coexist with mourning, that gratitude could be a source of strength rather than just an expression of satisfaction. As America moved into the final quarter of the 19th century, these lessons would be tested again and again. Economic depression, labor unrest, political corruption, and social upheaval would challenge American institutions and values in new ways. But the Thanksgiving tradition that had been forged during the Civil War would provide one source of stability and meaning, one way of maintaining faith in American possibilities, even when American realities fell short of American ideals. The Civil War generation had given their descendants more than just political union and economic opportunity. They had given them a tradition that honored the past while embracing the future, that acknowledged loss while celebrating survival, that maintained faith while recognizing the complexity of divine providence. They had created a holiday that was worthy of the nation they had fought to preserve and the values they had died to defend. Their gift to America was profound and enduring, but it came with the responsibility that each generation would have to accept or reject anew. The Thanksgiving they had created wasn't a museum piece, preserved under glass for admiration. It was a living challenge, a yearly invitation to examine what gratitude actually meant when life got complicated, when prosperity made sacrifice seem unnecessary, when peace made the lessons of war feel distant and irrelevant. Picture yourself standing in the parlor of a middle-class home in Chicago, November 1876. The wallpaper is new, the furniture polished, the gas lights steady and bright. Outside, the city hums with the energy of reconstruction and growth. The Great Fire of 1871 is becoming memory rather than reality. Business is booming. The future looks bright, and yet something feels different about this Thanksgiving compared to the ones that came before. The father of this household had been too young to fight in the war, but old enough to remember it. He recalls the anxiety that gripped his family when his older brother enlisted, the relief when letters arrived from the front, the grief when letters stopped coming. He remembers the Thanksgiving of 1863, when his mother set an empty place at the table and spoke his brother's name before they said grace. Now, 13 years later, that empty place has been filled by his own son, born after the war, who has never known anything but peace and prosperity. How do you explain to a child who has never missed a meal why Thanksgiving matters? How do you teach gratitude to someone who has never experienced genuine scarcity? How do you pass on lessons about community sacrifice to a generation that has grown up with individual success as the highest virtue? These weren't just personal challenges. They were cultural questions that would define how America understood itself as the 19th century wound toward its close. The answer, for many families, was story. The Thanksgiving table became a place where family history was preserved and transmitted, where the experiences of the Civil War generation were shared with children who had no direct memory of those times. Veterans told stories about military Thanksgivings, about sharing turkey with strangers who became brothers, about learning to find reasons for gratitude, even when those reasons weren't obvious. Mothers who had organized civilian relief efforts shared their own stories about community mobilization, about the satisfaction of contributing to something larger than their immediate families, about discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed. These weren't just entertainment. They were education, deliberate attempts to pass on values and perspectives that had been earned through genuine hardship. But stories, no matter how compelling, couldn't fully bridge the gap between lived experience and inherited memory. The children listening to these tales might appreciate them intellectually, but they couldn't feel them emotionally in the same way their parents did. They were receiving tradition rather than creating it, inheriting wisdom rather than earning it through their own trials. This generational challenge was playing out differently across the country. In rural areas where life remained physically demanding and economically uncertain, children could more easily understand their parents' lessons about gratitude and community. They still experienced genuine scarcity, still depended on their neighbours for survival, still understood that prosperity was fragile and required constant effort to maintain. But in rapidly growing cities, where industrial jobs provided unprecedented opportunities for individual advancement, where immigrant communities were creating new cultural syntheses, where traditional social structures were being challenged and reformed, the lessons of Civil War Thanksgiving felt increasingly remote. Urban children grew up in a world of gaslights and department stores, of public schools and professional entertainment, of individual opportunity and consumer choice. For them, Thanksgiving might become simply another day off from work or school, another occasion for family gathering and elaborate meal preparation, another opportunity for social display and cultural performance. The deeper meanings that had sustained their parents through genuine crisis might fade into pleasant tradition, maintained through habit rather than conviction. Religious leaders recognized this challenge and worked to address it through their Thanksgiving sermons and observances. Ministers who had lived through the war years tried to help their congregations understand that gratitude wasn't automatic, that it required conscious cultivation and regular practice. They emphasized that Thanksgiving was not just about acknowledging good fortune, but about recognizing the sources of that fortune and the obligations it created. Different denominations approached this challenge in different ways. Catholic priests emphasized Thanksgiving as part of a broader sacramental understanding of grace and divine providence. They taught that gratitude was a form of worship, a recognition of human dependence on God that should influence daily life rather than just annual celebration. Protestant ministers focused more on individual responsibility and social obligation, arguing that Thanksgiving should inspire charitable action and community service. Jewish communities found their own ways to connect American Thanksgiving traditions with their religious heritage. Rabbis drew parallels between Lincoln's proclamation and biblical calls for gratitude and remembrance. They emphasized how Thanksgiving could coexist with distinctly Jewish observances, how American civic participation could strengthen rather than threaten Jewish identity. But perhaps the most significant development in post-Civil War Thanksgiving observance was its increasing commercialization. What had begun as a simple family gathering and community celebration was becoming big business. Newspapers published elaborate Thanksgiving recipes and menu suggestions. Department stores promoted special Thanksgiving sales. Publishers produced Thanksgiving books and magazines. Restaurants offered Thanksgiving dinners for families who preferred not to cook. This commercialization wasn't entirely negative. It made Thanksgiving celebrations more accessible to families who lacked the time, resources, or knowledge to organize elaborate home-based observances. Immigrant families could learn American Thanksgiving traditions by purchasing American Thanksgiving products. Urban families could participate in Thanksgiving rituals even if they lacked extended family networks or traditional cooking facilities. But commercialization also threatened to transform Thanksgiving from a celebration of gratitude into a display of consumption. The focus shifted from acknowledging blessings received to demonstrating prosperity achieved. The elaborate menus that had once been aspirational ideals, promoted by magazines, became competitive standards that families felt obligated to meet or exceed. The tension between Thanksgiving as spiritual discipline and Thanksgiving as social performance would define much of the holiday's development during the late 19th century. Families struggled to maintain the deeper meanings that had made the holiday powerful while participating in the cultural expectations that had made it popular. They wanted to honor the sacrifices of previous generations while adapting to the opportunities of their own time. Women played particularly complex roles in navigating these tensions. They remained the primary organizers of family Thanksgiving celebrations, responsible for menu planning, food preparation, and social coordination. But they were also increasingly involved in public life through charitable organizations, reform movements, and professional activities that competed for their time and attention. The women who had learned organizational skills through wartime Thanksgiving efforts were now applying those capabilities to peacetime challenges that seemed equally urgent. They organized charitable activities for urban poor, supported education initiatives for immigrant children, promoted temperance and moral reform causes that they believed would improve American society. Thanksgiving became one activity among many in busy schedules that balanced domestic responsibilities with public engagement. This expansion of women's roles created new possibilities for Thanksgiving observance. Women's organizations began hosting community Thanksgiving dinners for people who lacked family connections. They organized charitable collections that channeled Thanksgiving gratitude into practical assistance for those in need. They used the holiday as an opportunity to demonstrate women's capacity for public leadership and social service. But it also created new pressures and expectations. Women were expected to maintain traditional Thanksgiving observances while also participating in modern public life. They were supposed to prepare elaborate family meals while also organizing community charitable activities. They were asked to preserve cultural traditions while also adapting to social change. The African American experience of Thanksgiving during this period reflected both progress and frustration with the pace of that progress. Legal emancipation had been achieved, but economic and social equality remained elusive. Black families gathering for Thanksgiving in the 1870s and 1880s were celebrating opportunities their ancestors could never have imagined, while confronting limitations that seemed increasingly arbitrary and unjust. Black churches remained central to African American Thanksgiving observances, but their emphasis evolved to reflect changing circumstances and concerns. Ministers continued to preach sermons that thanked God for emancipation while calling for continued struggle against discrimination and inequality. Congregations organized meals that celebrated community achievement while raising funds for education and civil rights activities. The Reconstruction Amendments had granted African Americans citizenship and voting rights, but these gains were being systematically undermined by violent intimidation, legal subterfuge, and economic pressure. By the 1880s, it was becoming clear that emancipation had been only the first step in a much longer struggle for full equality. Thanksgiving became one arena where these broader questions about American democracy and racial justice were confronted. Frederick Douglass, now an elder statesman of the civil rights movement, continued to speak about Thanksgiving as a measure of American progress toward its founding ideals. The holiday's true success, he argued, would be determined not by the enthusiasm of its celebration, but by the inclusiveness of its welcome. Could all Americans participate as equals? Could the holiday's promise of national unity become reality rather than just rhetoric? These questions were being answered differently in different regions and communities. In some northern cities, racial integration was becoming routine, if not always comfortable. Black and white families might attend the same churches, participate in the same civic organizations, even share some social interactions. But in the South, and in many other parts of the country, Thanksgiving remained segregated by law and custom. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 marked a turning point in African American hopes for full equality. The federal government's abandonment of efforts to protect black voting rights and civil liberties signaled that racial justice would not be achieved through political means alone. Thanksgiving celebrations in black communities took on new meanings as expressions of cultural resilience and community solidarity, rather than just gratitude for political progress. Black families used Thanksgiving gatherings to reinforce their own values and traditions, to celebrate their survival and achievement despite ongoing discrimination, to maintain hope for future progress, even when present circumstances offered little reason for optimism. The holiday became a way of affirming their belonging in American society, while acknowledging that full acceptance remained a distant goal. The immigrant experience of Thanksgiving during these decades reveals how the holiday was continuing to evolve in response to America's increasing diversity. Each new wave of immigration brought different cultural traditions, different religious practices, different understanding of celebration and community. Thanksgiving had to prove its capacity to accommodate this diversity while maintaining its essential American character. German immigrants, many of whom had fled political upheaval in Europe during the 1840s and 1850s, brought their own harvest festival traditions that could easily be adapted to American Thanksgiving observances. They contributed foods, customs, and perspectives that enriched American celebrations while maintaining their distinct cultural identity. Their participation demonstrated that becoming American didn't require abandoning all previous cultural allegiances. Irish immigrants, driven by famine and poverty, but also carrying strong Catholic traditions, found ways to connect Thanksgiving with their own religious observances and community practices. They used the holiday to demonstrate their American patriotism while maintaining their Irish identity and Catholic faith. Their large families and strong community networks helped establish Thanksgiving traditions in urban neighborhoods that might otherwise have lacked the social connections necessary for meaningful celebration. Scandinavian immigrants settling in the upper Midwest brought their own traditions of seasonal celebration and community cooperation that aligned naturally with Thanksgiving themes. Their experience with harsh winters and agricultural challenges helped them appreciate the gratitude and community solidarity that Thanksgiving was meant to foster. They contributed foods and customs that would become permanent parts of American Thanksgiving traditions in their regions. But not all immigrant experiences with Thanksgiving were smooth or comfortable. Chinese immigrants on the West Coast faced hostility and exclusion that made participation in American customs difficult and sometimes dangerous. They maintained their own seasonal celebrations and community traditions, often remaining largely separate from American Thanksgiving observances. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe brought their own complex relationship with Thanksgiving. They could appreciate the holiday's themes of gratitude and religious observance, which aligned with their own traditions. But they also had to navigate questions about how participation in American civic celebrations might affect their religious identity and community solidarity. Each group of immigrants faced similar challenges: how to participate in American cultural traditions while maintaining their own cultural identity, how to demonstrate American loyalty while preserving ancestral heritage, how to adapt to American expectations while meeting the needs of their own communities. The solutions they developed were as diverse as the immigrants themselves. Some embraced Thanksgiving enthusiastically as a way of demonstrating their American identity and commitment. Others participated reluctantly, viewing it as a requirement of American citizenship rather than a meaningful personal celebration. Still others found creative ways to blend American Thanksgiving traditions with their own cultural practices, creating new syntheses that enriched both traditions. These immigrant adaptations of Thanksgiving reveal how living traditions actually develop and change. They don't remain static, preserved exactly as their founders intended. Instead, they evolve through the accumulated choices and contributions of people who inherit them, adapt them, and pass them on to the next generation. Thanksgiving was becoming more authentically American, not by remaining unchanged, but by changing in response to America's increasing diversity. The Western expansion that continued throughout the late 19th century brought Thanksgiving to new territories and new populations. Miners in the Rocky Mountains, ranchers on the Great Plains, farmers in Oregon and Washington all found ways to observe the holiday, despite challenging circumstances and geographic isolation. Their celebrations were often modest compared to established Eastern traditions, but they maintained the essential elements of gathering, sharing, and expressing gratitude. These frontier Thanksgiving celebrations reveal the holiday's essential adaptability. It didn't require elaborate preparation or formal ceremony. It needed only the intention to acknowledge blessings, to share with others, and to maintain connection with larger American cultural traditions. A group of railroad workers sharing canned goods around a campfire could observe Thanksgiving as meaningfully as a wealthy family enjoying a formal dinner in their mansion. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, began to transform Thanksgiving logistics in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Families separated by continental distances could now travel to be together for the holiday. Fresh foods could be shipped across vast distances, making traditional Thanksgiving ingredients available in previously isolated locations. The holiday was becoming truly national in scope as well as official recognition. But the railroad also brought new challenges and complications. The same transportation networks that connected families also connected markets, creating economic pressures that disrupted traditional agricultural and community patterns. Small towns that had developed their own Thanksgiving traditions found themselves competing with urban commercial centers that offered more elaborate celebrations and more diverse opportunities. Native American responses to Thanksgiving continued to evolve as federal policies toward tribes became more systematically destructive. The reservation system, the destruction of buffalo herds, the forced education of Native children in government schools, all represented attempts to eliminate traditional Native cultures and force assimilation into American society. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving became a painful reminder of what they had lost rather than a celebration of what they had gained. The holiday commemorated European colonization and American expansion, the very processes that had destroyed their traditional ways of life and confined them to marginal lands. Participation in American Thanksgiving traditions required them to celebrate their own dispossession. But some Native Americans found ways to adapt Thanksgiving to their own purposes and perspectives. They used the holiday as an opportunity to maintain their own traditions of seasonal celebration and gratitude, while demonstrating their survival and resilience in the face of systematic oppression. They created their own interpretations of what Thanksgiving meant, focusing on gratitude for cultural survival rather than political inclusion. Individual Native Americans who had been educated in government or missionary schools faced particularly complex challenges in relating to Thanksgiving and other American traditions. They had been taught to abandon their tribal customs and adopt American ways. But they also experienced discrimination and marginalization that limited their full acceptance into American society. The holiday became another arena where questions of identity, belonging, and cultural authenticity were confronted. The Mormon experience with Thanksgiving in Utah Territory reveals another dimension of how the holiday adapted to diverse American experiences. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had their own strong traditions of community celebration and religious observance that could easily accommodate Thanksgiving themes. But they also had a complex relationship with federal authority due to conflicts over polygamy and theocratic governance. Mormon Thanksgiving celebrations emphasized community solidarity and divine providence in ways that aligned with their religious beliefs, while demonstrating their American patriotism. They used the holiday to show that their distinctive religious practices didn't prevent them from participating in American civic traditions. At the same time, they maintained their own interpretations of what those traditions meant and how they should be observed. The gradual resolution of conflicts between Mormon leadership and federal authorities allowed Utah's Thanksgiving celebrations to become more fully integrated into national patterns. But the Mormon experience demonstrates how even controversial religious minorities could find ways to participate in American civic traditions while maintaining their distinctive identities and practices. By the 1880s, Thanksgiving had achieved a stability and popularity that made it one of America's most widely observed holidays. It had survived the test of war, had proven its adaptability to diverse populations and circumstances, and had demonstrated its capacity to evolve while maintaining its essential character. The holiday had become more than an annual celebration. It had become an institution that helped define American civic culture. But this success also brought new challenges. As Thanksgiving became more popular and more commercialized, it risked losing the deeper meanings that had made it powerful during the Civil War years. The gratitude that had been earned through genuine hardship might become routine acknowledgement of routine prosperity. The community solidarity that had been forged under pressure might dissolve into individual consumption and social display. The generation that had created wartime Thanksgiving was aging and beginning to pass from the scene. Their children and grandchildren would inherit the traditions they had established, but without the experiences that had given those traditions their original meaning and urgency. How could the lessons learned through crisis be preserved during times of peace and prosperity? Different communities answered this challenge in different ways. Some emphasized the historical dimensions of Thanksgiving, using the holiday to teach children about the Civil War and its significance for American development. Others focused on contemporary applications, using Thanksgiving as an opportunity to address current social problems and community needs. Still others emphasized the spiritual dimensions, treating Thanksgiving as a religious observance that transcended particular historical circumstances. Religious leaders played crucial roles in helping communities maintain Thanksgiving's deeper meanings while adapting to changing circumstances. Ministers who had lived through the war years tried to help younger generations understand that gratitude wasn't automatic, that community required conscious effort, that celebration could coexist with acknowledgement of ongoing challenges and responsibilities. Women's organizations became particularly important in preserving Thanksgiving's community service dimensions while adapting them to peacetime needs. The same women who had organized wartime relief efforts now organized charitable Thanksgiving dinners for urban poor, Thanksgiving baskets for needy families, Thanksgiving programs for immigrants and minorities who might otherwise be excluded from community celebrations. These efforts help maintain Thanksgiving's connection to broader questions of social responsibility and community obligation. The holiday remained more than just family celebration or individual gratitude. It continued to be an occasion for acknowledging interdependence, for recognizing obligations to those less fortunate, for demonstrating that prosperity carried responsibilities as well as privileges. The children growing up with these expanded Thanksgiving traditions would carry them into the 20th century, when America would face new challenges that would test the lessons learned during the Civil War era. The holiday that had helped hold the Union together during its greatest domestic crisis would help America navigate the international responsibilities and domestic transformations that would define its emergence as a world power. The Spanish-American War, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, all would test Thanksgiving's capacity to provide meaning and community during times of trial. The holiday's success during these later challenges would depend largely on how well it had preserved the insights gained during the Civil War years. That gratitude could be a choice rather than just a response. That community required conscious effort and sacrifice. That celebration could acknowledge complexity rather than avoiding it. The Civil War generation's gift to America was more than just the establishment of a national holiday. They had created a model for how Americans could maintain hope and solidarity during difficult times. How they could find reasons for gratitude even when those reasons weren't obvious. How they could celebrate without ignoring the costs of what they were celebrating. These lessons would prove invaluable as America moved into the modern era. As the nation that had been preserved through civil war prepared to play increasingly important roles on the world stage. The Thanksgiving tradition that had been forged in the crucible of domestic conflict would help America understand and express its emerging international responsibilities and opportunities. But perhaps most importantly, the Civil War generation had established Thanksgiving as a tradition that was mature enough to handle difficult emotions and complicated circumstances. Their holiday didn't require everything to be perfect in order to find reasons for gratitude. It didn't demand unanimous agreement in order to celebrate community. It didn't need simple answers in order to acknowledge complex truths. This sophisticated understanding of what celebration could and should accomplish would serve America well in the challenging decades that lay ahead. The nation that had learned to give thanks in the midst of civil war would be better prepared for all the trials and triumphs that the 20th century would bring. The echoes of that first peacetime Thanksgiving in 1865 would ripple through American culture in ways that even Lincoln couldn't have foreseen. But here's what's fascinating about traditions born from crisis. They don't just disappear when the crisis ends. They evolve, adapt, and find new purposes that their creators never imagined. The Thanksgiving that emerged from the Civil War wasn't just about surviving one particular moment in history. It was about creating a framework for how Americans would understand gratitude, community, and national identity for generations to come. Picture yourself walking through the streets of any American city in 1880. The country has been at peace for 15 years. The economy is booming. Railroads connect distant communities. Telegraph lines carry news across the continent in minutes rather than weeks. The scars of war are healing, though they haven't disappeared entirely. And every November, families gather around tables that tell stories about who they are and where they've come from. But here's the thing about inherited traditions. They carry weight that the inheritors didn't earn themselves. The children sitting around those 1880 Thanksgiving tables had never experienced genuine scarcity. They'd never wondered if their letters home would reach their families. They'd never had to choose between eating their last piece of bread or saving it for a hungrier friend. Their gratitude was learned rather than earned, inherited rather than forged through trial. This generational shift created challenges that no one had anticipated. How do you teach someone to be grateful when they've never experienced want? How do you explain the importance of community to people who've grown up with individual success as the highest virtue? How do you preserve lessons about sacrifice when sacrifice no longer seems necessary? The answer, for many families, became storytelling. Thanksgiving tables transformed into theatres where family history was performed and preserved. Grandfathers who had marched with Sherman told stories about sharing hardtack with strangers who became brothers. Grandmothers who had organised relief societies described the satisfaction of sending care packages to soldiers they'd never meet. These weren't just entertainment, they were education, deliberate attempts to transmit values that had been purchased with blood and tears. But stories, no matter how compelling, couldn't bridge the experiential gap between those who had lived through crisis and those who had merely inherited its lessons. The children listening to these tales might appreciate them intellectually, but they couldn't feel them in their bones the way their elders did. They were receiving wisdom second-hand, like wearing clothes that had been tailored for someone else's body. Religious leaders understood this challenge and worked to address it through their Thanksgiving sermons. Ministers, who had preached about divine testing during wartime, now faced the task of making gratitude relevant during prosperity. They emphasized that Thanksgiving wasn't just about acknowledging good fortune, but about recognizing the sources of that fortune and the obligations it created. They taught that genuine gratitude required more than feeling thankful. It demanded action. Churches began organizing community Thanksgiving dinners for people who had no families to celebrate with. They collected food for the poor, visited the sick, and created charitable programs that channeled holiday gratitude into year-round service. The holiday was evolving from private family celebration into public demonstration of community responsibility. Women played crucial roles in this transformation. The organizational skills they'd developed during wartime relief efforts proved perfectly suited to peacetime charitable work. They understood logistics, they knew how to coordinate volunteers, and they had networks of contacts that spanned entire regions. Most importantly, they understood that meaningful celebration required genuine sacrifice. The Ladies' Aid Societies that had sent food to Civil War soldiers now organized Thanksgiving baskets for urban poor. The church committees that had coordinated hospital visits for wounded veterans now arranged Thanksgiving dinners for elderly residents who might otherwise spend the holiday alone. The same energy that had sustained the home front during wartime found new outlets in peacetime community service. But this expansion of Thanksgiving's meaning also created new tensions. The holiday was becoming simultaneously more commercial and more charitable, more elaborate and more inclusive, more traditional and more innovative. Department stores promoted Thanksgiving sales while churches organized Thanksgiving charity drives. Restaurants offered elaborate holiday meals while soup kitchens served free dinners to anyone who needed them. This commercialization wasn't entirely negative. It made Thanksgiving celebrations accessible to families who lacked the knowledge, time, or resources to organize traditional home-based observances. Immigrant families could learn American customs by purchasing American products. Urban families could participate in holiday rituals even if they lacked extended family networks or traditional cooking facilities. But it also threatened to transform Thanksgiving from a celebration of gratitude into a display of consumption. The elaborate menus that had once been aspirational ideals became competitive standards that families felt obligated to meet. The focus shifted from acknowledging blessings received to demonstrating prosperity achieved. The holiday risked becoming more about what you could afford than what you were grateful for. Different communities navigated these tensions in different ways. Rural families often maintained simpler celebrations that emphasized family connections and seasonal rhythms. Urban families experimented with more elaborate observances that incorporated new foods, new customs, and new forms of entertainment. Immigrant communities created hybrid celebrations that blended American traditions with their own cultural practices. The African American experience of Thanksgiving during this period reflected both the promise and the limitations of American equality. Black families could participate in the national holiday as free citizens for the first time in American history. They could gather in their own homes, prepare their own meals, and make their own choices about how to observe the day. These simple freedoms, taken for granted by others, carried profound meaning for people who remembered when such choices were impossible. Black churches became centers for Thanksgiving celebrations that combined traditional religious observance with explicit political messages about citizenship and civil rights. Ministers preached sermons that thanked God for emancipation while calling for continued progress toward full equality. Congregations organized meals that celebrated community achievements while raising funds for education and political organizing. But the end of Reconstruction in 1877 had shattered many hopes for rapid progress toward racial justice. The federal government's abandonment of efforts to protect black civil rights signaled that equality would not be achieved through political means alone. Thanksgiving celebrations in black communities took on new meanings as expressions of cultural resilience rather than political optimism. Frederick Douglass, now in his 60s, continued to speak about Thanksgiving as a measure of American progress toward its founding ideals. But his rhetoric had evolved from hopeful expectation to patient determination. The holiday's true success, he argued, would be measured not by legal proclamations or political promises, but by the daily reality of how Americans treated each other across racial lines. These questions were being answered differently across the country. In some northern cities, racial integration was becoming routine, if not always comfortable. Black and white families might attend the same churches, work in the same businesses, even participate in some of the same social activities. But in the South, and in many other regions, Thanksgiving remained segregated by law and custom. The immigrant experience of Thanksgiving revealed how the holiday was adapting to America's increasing diversity. Each wave of newcomers brought different traditions, different foods, different understandings of celebration and community. The holiday's survival depended on its capacity to accommodate this diversity while maintaining its essentially American character. German immigrants contributed their own harvest festival customs that enriched American celebrations. Irish families brought Catholic traditions that added religious depth to holiday observances. Scandinavian settlers in the Midwest introduced foods and customs that became permanent features of regional Thanksgiving traditions. Each group found ways to participate in American civic life while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. But not all immigrant experiences were smooth. Chinese immigrants on the West Coast faced hostility that made participation in American customs difficult and sometimes dangerous. Eastern European Jews had to navigate complex questions about how American civic participation might affect their religious obligations and community solidarity. Each group faced the challenge of becoming American without abandoning everything that had made them who they were. The solutions they developed were as diverse as the immigrants themselves. Some embraced Thanksgiving enthusiastically as proof of their American loyalty. Others participated reluctantly, viewing it as a requirement of citizenship rather than a meaningful personal celebration. Still others created innovative blends of American and ancestral traditions that enriched both cultures. So the next time you sit down for Thanksgiving dinner, remember that you're not just participating in a family tradition. You're continuing a conversation that began in the darkest chapter of American history, when a nation torn apart by war chose gratitude over despair, hope over hatred, and community over division. The empty chair at your table carries the same weight as those first empty chairs in 1863. The stories shared over turkey and pie echo the letters soldiers wrote from muddy camps to families they might never see again. And the choice to give thanks, despite whatever challenges you're facing, honors the courage of people who found reasons to be grateful when the very survival of their country hung in the balance.